Thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to have you here. My name is Adam Ereli. I'll be moderating the panel today. And let's first thank the National Council of Resistance of Iran, the U.S. chapter, for putting this together. And thank you all for coming for what is and showing interest in what is a very important topic. We're here to discuss a new book that explores a very dark chapter in the history of not just Iran, but the civilized world. Iran, where mass murderers rule, the 1988 massacre of 30,000 political prisoners, and the continuing atrocities. So as the title suggests, this particular chapter in Iranian's history began in July of 1988. It lasted for several months, and on the instructions of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khomeini, the apparatus of the Iranian state systematically executed an estimated 30,000 men, women, and children who were members of a dissident political movement and who refused to pledge and executed them because they refused to pledge loyalty to the regime. As the book points out, many of the perpetrators of this crime are in positions of high authority in the current government of Iran. There has been no investigation and no accountability for these crimes. And what this has produced is a culture of impunity that Iran's rulers exploit to continue arresting, torturing, and murdering at will and without consequences or penalty. The purpose of our panel today is to examine this pattern of abuse and outrage, to talk about what does it look like, how does it operate, what are some of its consequences, and very importantly, what can we do as concerned citizens and as concerned sort of global citizens to put an end to this culture of impunity. As I read the book, and as the book points out, there have been similar crimes against humanity, massacres in the past. Srebrenica comes to mind. Sinjar, the atrocities at Sinjar in Iraq mobilized the world community against ISIS. Halabja mobilized the world community against Saddam Hussein. It is astounding to me that this crime, the Summer of Blood, has not produced similar outrage and similar mobilization. History has taught us that the only way to stop rogue regimes from using terror and murder as tools of their rule is to hold them accountable for their crimes. So that really is, I think, where we want to come out in today's discussion. How do we hold them accountable? The U.S. and the U.S. government and people in the United States have an important role to play. How can we sanction the regime? How can we take steps like the Magnitsky Act, which sanctioned the Russian regime for the murder of one Russian in prison? Can we do that for Iran, for the rulers of Iran who are still in power, who killed a lot more than just one of their citizens in prison? Pushing for a UN special rapporteur to investigate these crimes. So joining me today for a discussion of these and other questions is a very distinguished panel of friends and colleagues. To my immediate left is Ambassador, a lot of ambassadors up here, by the way, Ambassador Kenneth Blackwell, who in his remarks will be talking from his personal experience as a U.S. ambassador to the United Nations Human Rights Commission. To his left is Miss Soona Samsami, who is with the National Council of Resistance of Iran and is the U.S. representative of the United States for this organization. She's an activist in gender equality, and really nobody knows better the reality inside Iran than Soona, and I think she'll be the first to talk to us about some of the details and important aspects of the events of 1988. Next in line will be the Honorable Linda Chavez, who is chairman of the Center for Equal Opportunity. Importantly, for the purposes of this discussion, Ms. Chavez was the staff director on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights under President Reagan, and was also elected by the United Nations Human Rights Commission to serve as the U.S. expert to the UN Subcommission on the Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Minorities. Finally, wrapping all of it up will be my good friend, Ambassador Mark Ginsburg. Mark has been a strong supporter of action to constrain the mullahs in Iran. He served as U.S. Ambassador to Morocco from 1994 to 1998, Deputy Senior Advisor to the President of the United States for Middle East Policy, and Legislative Assistant to Senator Edward Kennedy. He is an indefatigable activist and agitator, and we'll look forward to hearing him agitate with us today about this important issue. Cogitate, agitate, regurgitate, whatever. Infuriate. So let me turn it over to Ms. Soona to give a little expose on the events of 1988 and subsequent developments. Soona, over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador Ereli, for your beginning remarks. Thank you from very distinguished panelists today. And before I start talking about the 1988 massacre, I'd like to mention about my deepest sympathy to our fellow citizen in Kermanshah province, the scene of devastating earthquake in month of November, and some 3,000 people have been killed, thousands wounded, and tens of thousands lost everything they had. And Iranian government haven't done anything, and people, as we speak today, are very suffering. In terms of 1988, Iranian regime today is the Iran regime is title holder of the most executions per capita in the world today, and also is the only nation in the world that executes juveniles. Absence of religious, judicial, and legal freedoms is a typical Iranian's day-to-day life. This week, our office in Washington published this book entitled Iran, Where Mass Murderers Rule, and Massacre of 30,000 Political Prisoners and the Continuing Atrocities. This book, which are releasing today, it's important because not what happened in 1988, almost 30 years ago, but it's what's happening today. And this regime is continuing the same path of killing and executions. Every day, new blood from a new Iranian citizen is spilled on the hands of an inhuman, corrupt regime. These hands, however, are the same hands today as we are 30 years later. It's also intended to say that inaction and time will never miraculously result in progress. The Iranian regime's current climate proves this without a shadow of doubt. Since Rouhani took office as president in 2013, so far more than 3,000 people, the exact number is 3,111 people, been executed on his watch. Virtually all these executions are in contravention of internationally recognized standards, such as presumption of innocence access to lawyers, public trials, and lack of due process. And it goes without saying, the quality of Iranians' executions is about as inhuman as the quality of their day-to-day lives. The 3,000 plus victims executed in these 4 years, in many instances in public hangings, from cranes, cover a vast demographic, from impoverished substance abusers to persons who were minors at the time of their sentencing, to mentally challenged offenders, to dissidents, as well as ethnic and religious minorities. There is no end and there are no exceptions, and their crime is only they are standing against extremism in Iran. That happened since 1988 and continues today. The only crime they are is that they are standing against extremism. While the United States made strides on the global stage with civil rights movement in 1960s and South Africa with its abolition of apartheid in the 1990s, it has been 4 decades since 1979 revolution, and as the world marks Human Rights Day in a week, civil, political, social, and individual rights in Iran are as non-existent today as they were 3 decades ago. When it comes to human rights and personal freedoms, for nearly 80 million Iranians, every day is 1988. In a sense, that time stood still for decades. Citizen rights today are equivalent, if not worse than, the rights of those murdered in that summer nearly 30 years ago. One may ask why the Iranian regimes continue to perpetrate such atrocities and continuing. The answer is simple. It fears its population. As you see, just last year, more than 11,000 demonstrations all over cities in Iran has been taking place. And that's why Iranian regime continuously executes Iranian people to silence them, to suppress them, not to be outspoken about a future and freedom in Iran. The flip side of it is this population, which is growing emboldened by day. Nearly 11,000 protest acts in different cities. Nurses, teachers, taxi drivers, professors, all sectors of Iranian society are coming out loud about what is happening in Iran. And despite harsh crackdown, the regime has been unable to extinguish the Iranian people's yearning for change, freedom, and human rights. The tide has surely turned against the regime. On the 29th anniversary of 1988 massacre, NCRI President Maryam Rajavi outlined the actions she believed Iranians should take in order to expand the call for justice movement. She said, quote, "The Iranian people and resistance will not sit back until the perpetrators of 1988 massacre of political prisoners, many of whom currently hold key positions in the current government, are brought to justice," unquote. Though there is damning evidence against many current government officials, several of whom have admitted their guilt in 1988 massacre, the perpetrators of 1998 remain in power still today. There is still no accountability amongst members of the regime. Another crucial injustice is lack of information regarding the victims of the 1988 massacre. While the regime has acknowledged the occurrence of the killings, very little known about the victims and location where they are buried, and actual numbers, and so on. This has been continuing so far. The names of perpetrators of massacre, some of which have been revealed over the course of last 2 years, must also be revealed to the public to facilitate justice and accountability. The way forward, certainly, The way forward certainly involves holding the regime accountable for not only its past crime against humanity, but current violations as well. The regime continues to imprison and kill political prisoners simply because their association with Mujahideen Khalq, MEK, inside Iran, and almost always fails to give them fair trials for any of them. Governments and organizations must condemn the regime to an even greater degree. Verbal disapproval is not enough to hold the nefarious deeds that have been taking place in 1988 and as today. Members of the Iranian regime have acknowledged both the massacre occurred and admitted their role with pride in the Summer of Blood, paving the way for a UN response. And other political killings have been investigated by the international community, and it's time now, the 1988 massacre, to be followed and be detailed and investigated by the United Nations to closure and bring up front what happened then and what is happening today, every day in Iran. Thank you very much.
Our next commentator will be Ambassador Linda Chavez. Linda Sooma talked, I think, very eloquently about the popular movements in Iran, as these show us. And I was wondering if you could talk, given your experience in this field, about the role of women in the quest for justice and in the political activism that we're seeing now.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And yes, I'd be glad to talk about that. I want to begin, though, at the beginning for me and how I came to know people like Soona and those involved in the MEK. It occurred when I was at the United Nations, when I was an independent expert, the U.S. expert to the Subcommission on the Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Minorities. There were always people in the coffee area outside the room at the Palais des Nations in Geneva who were handing out information, and the women often wore scarves on their head, and the men were very gentlemanly, and they would approach the various delegates and hand us brochures and information, and it was always about what was occurring in Iran. And as a member of the subcommission, I was always a little bit baffled why there was not more condemnation of the grotesque human rights violations that were going on in Iran. And I was disappointed that even the American government did not seem to want to hear these stories. So as a result, because I was an independent expert, my government couldn't tell me how to vote or what to say at that subcommission, I took it upon myself to learn more about the MEK and about their story and what was going on in Iran. And I offered resolutions along with some of my co-delegates from Great Britain and elsewhere to condemn that behavior. Well, that was a fairly long time ago. It was in 1992. Interestingly, it was just a few short years after the massacre that had occurred in 1988. And for all of the years that I've been involved with the MEK, I've heard about this great massacre. There were thousands, tens of thousands of people who were subjected to extrajudicial killings. They were put to death, often in public settings, as soon as suggested, hung from cranes, hung on Friday in the public square, so that it would send a message of terror, really, to the Iranian people. But until recently, those reports were not substantiated by hard evidence, and they certainly were not admitted to by those in the Iranian government, which is why I think it is so important that this book has been published. You can sit and read every page and digest it within an hour. It is a short read, but it is a very important one, and I commend all of you to take copies of this and to read what happened. There was a mass massacre, and we've seen these kinds of genocides. We've seen what happened in Rwanda, as you said, in Srebrenica, and other places where thousands of people were murdered, often, though, by mobs, as in the case of Rwanda. What took place in 1988, though, was very different. It was much more a crime of the state. It was the state and its various organs that were rounding up people, imprisoning them, torturing them, and ultimately executing them, and then dumping their bodies into mass graves, which have yet to be discovered. We hear today a lot about Iran, but most of the talk is about Iran's ambitions to build nuclear weapons and the agreement that was reached, the mutual agreement of understanding that was reached that was supposed to halt that movement towards building nuclear weapons. We don't often hear about the human rights situation, and I think this is a real tragedy, and it is a tragedy for us as Americans, because as long as I can remember, dating back to my childhood, human rights has always been front and center, part and parcel of American foreign policy, and it must remain so. So we need to focus on these human rights abuses. Now, I've been asked to talk primarily about women. We have a society in Iran in which it would be an understatement to say half of the population are regarded as second-class citizens. Women in Iran are not even given the rights of second-class citizenship. Their word cannot be taken equal to a man's word in a court of law. If a husband wishes to divorce his wife and simply cast her off, she has virtually no rights. She cannot even have a right to her own children. Women who wish to express themselves in terms of their clothing, in terms of wearing makeup or not wearing makeup, have no choice in that matter, at least with respect to being in the public square. And if women do not don the full hijab, cover their hair, cover their faces, dress in what the clerics consider modest attire, they can, in fact, be taken off the streets. They can be subjected to punishment, which includes flogging. I mean, this is a really medieval concept. Women put to the lash because they didn't cover their hair properly. Perhaps a few hair strays snuck out from the scarf. And these masses of vice police roaming the streets, taking women off the streets to subject them to that kind of mistreatment. And it's not only that the organs of the state do that. We have individuals who run in gangs who are kind of ex officio members of the state. They are the thugs of the state who operate with impunity, who roam the streets, and when they see a woman that they feel is not looking or behaving modestly enough under their standards. There were acid attacks in several cities in Iran in which young women had their faces disfigured, were blinded by acid being thrown in the face. And what happens to those perpetrators under the Iranian system? Is it the perpetrators who throw acid on an innocent woman's face who end up being picked up and questioned and tried for their crimes? No, it's the women. It's the women who are deemed to have committed a crime because they did not do what the mullahs have told them to do. So it's important to focus, I think, on what has happened in the past in Iran. But as Soona suggested, it would be a mistake to think that these are all crimes of history, that what we're trying to do is to bring some measure of justice to crimes committed in the past. That would be a noble enough endeavor. But the problem is those crimes continue to this day. Women are hanged. Young girls are hanged. And Soona mentioned that Iran is the only country in the world that allows children, essentially, to be executed. And again, we have, even in this law, which in and of itself is a travesty, we have a disparity between those who are male, who are accused of committing crimes warranting execution, and females. A female can be executed at the age of 9 lunar years. This is astounding. What could a 9 or 10 or 11-year-old girl possibly do that would require her execution? Well, one of the things that she could do would be to be associated with one of the outlawed groups, like the MEK. And in reading some of the stories in this book, you'll read stories about young women who were brought before these death committees and subjected to a kind of kangaroo court. To call these tribunals, to think of this in terms of a justice system, again, is a travesty. These were committees that were made up of intelligence officials, clerics, and those who were the hand-picked sponsors of the regime. They were brought in for questioning. The prisons were used to house people not guilty of actual crimes, not for things like theft or murder or other crimes, but because of their political views, because of their religious views, because they happened to be seen passing out pamphlets on the street that talked about things like the right to vote, the right to be able to make decisions independently, the right to be able to exercise your conscience. And if any of that material could in any way be tied to the MEK, those offenses would not just warrant years in prison, they could end up warranting execution. And that's what we read about in this book. Well, have things changed today for women? No, as I say, they have not. Women in Iran continue to be subject to gross human rights violations. They are not treated as equals under this system. And I think one of the most interesting things that we're seeing, and you can see it even in the pictures in terms of what's happening today, is that there is a rebellion by the Iranian people. Even under the threat of torture, of lashings, of being thrown into a prison and never seen again, perhaps being hanged, nonetheless, people are taking to the streets. And among those people, and among the leadership of those people, are women. And it is no accident that the MEK today is led by a woman, Madam Miriam Rajavi. She stands as a real affront to this regime. And one of the reasons I think the regime hates and fears the MEK is because in the MEK, women can take leadership roles. Women are allowed to be equals. Women are allowed to lead others. And men are willing to listen to them and to follow them. And this is a major threat to a regime that wants to imprison half its people. Miriam Rajavi has a 10-point plan which reads very much like the Bill of Rights in the American Constitution, guaranteeing free press, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, the right to be able to select one's own leaders, the right to fair trial. All of these things strike at the heart of this regime. So I want to commend to you Iran, where mass murders rule, to say that though this uncovers an important part of history, the most important message of this book is that this regime is still in place. The people who perpetrated these atrocities serve in government posts in the current regime. And we, as people who believe in human rights, cannot let that go unnoticed and unmentioned. We must speak out. Thank you.
That was great, Linda. Thank you so much. So we're now going to do a little bit of pivot on the panel. I think Soona and Linda shone a light on the horrors of the past and what Iran looks like in the present. We want to now look to the future. So our next two panelists are going to talk about what can we do about this, right? Both accountability for 1988, as well as constraining the crimes of the regime against its own citizens today. The first up on the second half of our program is Ambassador Kenneth Blackwell, who in his time at the UN had a lot of experience with investigating crimes against humanity. What does that look like? What do we need to do? And how does that apply to the situation that we're talking about today? So, Ambassador Khan, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam. And I will do a half pivot. Let me first say that it was a high honor to be asked to write the foreword to this very important work, and I commend its reading to all within my voice, the hearing of my voice. I'm also honored and have had the privilege of being involved in international movements that have demanded access, transparency, accountability, justice, and closure for the families of the victims of mass murder in Iran. In the 1990s, I had the privilege of working with Dr. Clyde Snow. As one of the world's foremost experts in forensic anthropology, Dr. Snow played an instrumental role in bringing justice to Argentina by uncovering the mass graves left behind by the country's dirty war. His actions and investigations helped uncover the truth about what was an incredibly deadly series of crimes carried out over nearly a decade. Holding the regime in Argentina accountable set a valuable precedent and demonstrated the global community's commitment to upholding justice and human rights, which we, in fact, must maintain today. After the fall of the military government in Argentina, forensic scientists were invited to the country in order to investigate the atrocities committed by the dirty war. One of these scientists was Clyde Snow, who recruited a group of Argentine students who to aid in his investigation. His investigation and his leadership of the team through the methodical excavations of unmarked graves, carefully organized and recorded all of the remains and evidence found. His findings brought brought light to the families, and this is most important, of the victims, who previously had no knowledge of their relatives' fate. His testimony and evidence presented in court also led to the conviction of several members of the junta dictatorship. Today, in Argentina, that group of forensic anthropologists, that team, is still in existence, and as a result of Dr. Snow's inquiry, continues to use his methods to investigate human rights abuses. It has been my strong advocacy within the U.S. government that we demand access of this sort of team to Iran. I think if, in fact, we keep the pressure, and it's part of the comprehensive pressure that we put on the regime, we can help bring closure to the families of the victims of the Summer of Blood in 1988. There is a passage in Scripture that says, "Those who would do evil love the darkness. We know that violent, evil regimes love the darkness. It is incumbent upon us as individuals, us as nation states, and as communities of nation states to put the pressure on the regime to give access to the community so that we might shine lights, individual lights, collective lights, on the evils that were done in the name of the regime. As a consequence of our constant pressure, we give hope to the folks who are inside of Iran. We, in fact, light their candles. We, in fact, help them punch holes in the darkness. And so I have worked with our delegation at the United Nations with Ambassador Healy and asking for their constant demand for access for the sort of work that Dr. Snow did to be repeated in Iran. Now, again, we meet great resistance, but the resistance perhaps is evidence that they have something to hide. So even when we meet that resistance, the effort that we put forth is a constant reminder of what the people who are presently under the hammer of Iran, of the regime, are experiencing. So what do we want to do? We want to keep up the pressure. We want to demand that our delegation at the UN continues to be a leading voice, not only on the threats of international terrorism that is perpetuated by and advanced by the regime, but we in fact want to bring justice to those human rights fighters who in fact have the experience of a brutal history of where people who were just passing out leaflets in 1988 were part of the human victims of a regime that is dark, that is anti-human rights, and that is a threat to the basic fabric of humanity across the globe. Our call can only be amplified by meetings such as this and by reading works and evidence like that is presented in this work. Thank you,
sir. So now we're gonna turn to the swamp, and our both myself and my colleague Mark are denizens of the swamp. Mark, specifically, can you talk, building on what Ken said, can you talk about what Washington can do to hold the regime in Iran accountable, number one, what needs to be done, what can be done, how it can be done, but number two, really how human rights and the human rights issue fits into the broader strategy with regard to Iran when we talk about its nuclear, constraining its nuclear program, constraining its malign activity, its support for terror around the world. And there was one point that Ken raised that I thought was kind of interesting. Well, a lot of points, but one of in particular where he says, evil lives in the darkness, need to shine a light, need access and get the information. That was kind of done in the nuclear program back in the day when people would actually, the UN and other international bodies would go in and investigate. They've never been able to get to the military sites, but talk a little bit about how to get that access.
Sure. Thank you very much, Adam, and it's a real honor to be with all of you. And one of the things that when Linda was speaking, it just reminded me, among all of the people who've been here, the distinguished service and the commitment that each of them have brought, and the honor of being with them. I want to start out by saying that my training in this area started proudly working for Senator Edward Kennedy, who was chairman of the Human Rights and Immigration and Refugee Subcommittee of the Senate Judiciary Committee. I was 21 years old and became indoctrinated in the methodology of preserving, protecting, and enhancing human rights and the rights of people who are displaced. And over the last few years, watching the terrible ordeals that the people of Iran, and particularly those who oppose the current regime, whether they lived in Camp Ashraf or Camp Liberty, the violations of human rights that were suffered by these people alone, reminded me about how little Americans and Europeans truly appreciate and understand the plight of the Iranian people under essentially a dictatorial state sponsor of terror. And when we say state sponsor of terror, we wind up at times projecting that outward. Oh, Iran is a state sponsor of terror. It supports Hamas, it supports Hezbollah. It is engaged in terrorism around the world. At times, I think our greatest fallacy in this is not reminding ourselves that it is the largest state sponsor of terror against its own people. Against its own people. I took the time when I was asked by the National Council to read the 2016 Human Rights Report issued by the State Department. I consider it to be a whitewash, the last report of the Obama administration. I'm proud as a Democrat who's been involved in democratic foreign policy and has worked for Democratic presidents and vice presidents to express my deep concern that the Obama administration's willingness to focus all of its energies in concluding an Iran nuclear agreement at the cost of absolving Iran of its human rights violations, of absolving Iran of how it is mistreating dual nationals, of Iran mistreating its people, of Iran, in effect, being given a pass in order for the administration to achieve its desired goal to conclude this agreement. And what is concerning me, and continues to concern me, is that Europe, which we let's not forget mentioning, and the United States are partners in an agreement right now that is providing financial support as well as political support to a regime that camouflages all too well its violations of human rights. If I had been an ambassador in Iran and had been asked to write this report, there is no way that I would have permitted this report to have been issued by the State Department under the Obama administration. It represents what essentially is a lack of condemnation of human rights violations across the board. While it details, in some respects, many of the atrocities, there's no conclusions and recommendations. There's no conclusions and recommendations. So in some respects, human rights in the last few years in Iran have become an inconvenient, the violation of human rights has become an inconvenient truth to those, particularly on my side of the aisle, who have decided that the Iran nuclear agreement is what begins and ends our engagement with Iran. And that must change. And it must change in the following ways, if I may, Adam.
Please.
Okay? First of all, the idea that the Congress is not using the decertification by the president to now force a new review of Iran's human rights violations, to me, is essential. It's essential that Congress use this occasion to rebalance and recalibrate exactly what is going on and not at the expense of our stated goals of achieving, in effect, more human rights for the people of Iran, but understanding that the government of Iran under President Rouhani is no champion of human rights. And there's a perception or a willingness on the part of people like Secretary of State Kerry and organizations that he helped organize, including an organization called Diplomacy Works, to whitewash and to deny incorporating into the debate about Iran its human rights violations. That is, to me, as a Democrat, patently unacceptable. If anything, we Democrats should be champions of holding Iran accountable. That is our legacy. And ironically, it may in fact wind up being the Trump administration that achieves that goal. But it's going to take greater support in Congress. So, number one, sanctions are going to be reviewed by Congress before the end of this month. There's no doubt that there is additional financial transfers that are going to be provided to Iran under the JCPOA. To me, it's time that we basically said enough is enough. We need to now begin holding Iran accountable. The great bet that the Obama administration made that by concluding an Iran nuclear agreement, this would in effect temper the regime's worst instincts, is turned out to be patently unacceptable and false. We've heard on this panel today that the number of executions, the violations of human rights, the locking up of journalists has increased rather than decreased under the current regime. Number two, as I want to subscribe to what my friend Adam has suggested, that is that the people who are listed in this book who've perpetrated these atrocities need to be sanctioned by the administration, similar to the way that the United States and Congress sanctioned those Russians who were responsible for extrajudicial killings inside Russia under the Magnitsky Act. The president right now does not need Congress to list these people as people who will be sanctioned by the Treasury Department. So that's something we all need to work and encourage the administration to undertake. Number three, these think tanks in this city are not doing enough to shed light on the human rights violations that are perpetrated by Iran. Too much focus is on the status of the Iran nuclear agreement. We must, in effect, expand the debate about Iran. It is not merely the issue of the Iran nuclear agreement. It's its violation as a state sponsor of terror of all the norms that we consider to be essential to our freedom and security abroad, as well as to the people of Iran at home. Number three, where is the voice of America for Iran? Where are we going to, in effect, step back and while never having to acknowledge or to hold the administration accountable for what its policies may be, I want to see more media that is piped into the Iranian people to provide them hope and inspiration and support from the American people. Now, I understand that there's been a great deal of debate and discussion about that within the administration, but when you do not have a Secretary of State who wants to lead in this area, then you will not have the State Department and the Board of Broadcasting Governors undertake this. So one of the things that I would like to see is the expansion of, in effect, a media initiative by the United States government, whether it be television or otherwise. Condoleezza Rice killed this as Secretary of State, especially when there was the Green Revolution. We cannot, in effect, stand back and permit that to happen again. The money is there. The will has to be there. Number three, the European Court of Human Rights, as well as European governments, also have a responsibility for enforcing their doctrines and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights against Iran. Here, too many companies that are, in effect, buying into the investment side of the Iran nuclear deal are overpowering those in Europe who should be becoming, in effect, the greatest spokesman for change inside Iran. We're going to need more people in Europe who will hold Iran accountable for these violations, similarly to sanction these individuals as well as others who are engaged in human rights violations. I want to close by saying that the people of Iran deserve better from the United States. Too often, whether it be the people at Camp Liberty, the people at Camp Ashraf, the people who suffered in the 2008, the people who in effect rose up to defy over the years the regime that was brutally determined to suppress them. We Americans owe it to what we in effect bequeathed to the people of Iran in 1979, a remedy to change the plight that they face. And as a proud Democrat, I think it's essential that my party and the people who unfortunately embraced their belief that the only thing that matters to them is the Iran nuclear agreement need to, in effect, be held accountable and in time shamed into realizing that their true calling, and it always has been as the Democratic Party, human rights comes first, not appeasing a regime. Thank you.
Way to end with a bang, Mark.
That's what you asked for.
Yeah, that's why you're you, and we love you. But seriously, thank you all for such a stimulating and wide-ranging discussion. We will take questions from the audience. So if you have questions, just write them down and give them to our interns. I want to just start by let me take the privilege of asking the first question. Of really, I think, Ambassador Blackwell and Ambassador Chavez, who have a history of not only involvement in international organizations devoted to human rights, but also a history of community activism as Secretary of State and, was it Mayor of Cincinnati? Mm-hmm. And Ambassador Chavez in your communities as well?
Not an ambassador. I'm only an honorable woman, not an ambassador. Okay. But thank you for the promotion.
Honorable woman. That's a great title. Actually, all women are honorable. So you're the right honorable, most honorable. Can you talk a little bit about, because we've focusing on the issue of ending the culture of impunity and holding officials accountable and bringing light, into the darkness. Can you talk about, and we've talked about Washington, and we've talked about the government, we've talked about Congress, et cetera, but as local officials and as community activists, particularly relevant to the way the Iranian diaspora and NCRI works, what can ordinary citizens and communities do to advance this agenda?
Well, ladies go first, I guess, so I'll take it. It's a very interesting thing as I listened to Mark, and I want to compliment him for being willing to criticize his own party. And one of the very striking things, you're seeing a very, very rare event here in Washington, D.C., in which we actually have bipartisanship around an issue. You have Republicans and you have Democrats united to support an issue. But in thinking back, there was a time, Mark, when I was a Democrat as well, as was my husband. And when I think about what it is that can be done to apply pressure, and you mentioned, Adam, the diaspora here in the United States. My husband was involved years ago in organizing a march in Washington on behalf of Nathan Sharansky, who was being held in prison in the Soviet Union. And at that time, there were people on both sides of the aisle, Democrats and Republicans, for whom human rights really mattered. Secretary of State George Shultz under President Reagan once told me that he never went to a meeting with his counterparts in the Soviet Union when the issue of the plight of Soviet Jews and other dissidents within the Soviet Union was not raised. It was raised at every single meeting. Well, I think this administration, part of President Trump's persona, part of his ideology, such as it is to think only about America. Every decision he makes, whether it's on trade or legislation or anything, seems to be involved with what's good for America. Well, unfortunately, what happens when you take that very narrow, I think, myopic vision is that you ignore issues like human rights. And I think this administration and Congress need to feel the pressure. When tens of thousands of people walked down the streets and in front of the White House when Nathan Sharansky was being held, suddenly people started listening. There are tens of thousands of Iranians who live in the United States, who have become U.S. citizens, who are pillars of their community. And I think that kind of activism, that kind of number, that kind of public display that says we are Americans, but we also have roots in Iran. And what is happening in Iran to the families that we left behind, to our aunts and uncles and brothers and sisters and parents and maybe children, matters to us. And as American citizens, we want our government to have this matter to them as well. So I think that those kinds of public demonstrations, and the MEK has held some. I've stood in front of the White House with the MEK, and I've been to events around the country. But I think it needs to be more focused. I think it needs to be broad. And I think the focus has to be on the American leadership in Congress and in the White House to make this issue front and center of American foreign policy.
Adam, I'll just start out with a personal story. When I was growing up, early on, my family lived in public housing before my father was able to move us into market housing. And there was a sort of social fabric of that community, public housing community. And so I had an adopted aunt in every window along the way. And so I could get in trouble at this end of the public housing community. And by the time I got home, my mother already had the news. And that was evidence to me that while the young folks today have the internet, we experienced the auntie net, moved information just as fast. And so the power of the individual and the individual engagement is something that we can't lose sight of. The use of social media is very important, and the empowerment of the NGO communities. The bringing light to the situation and the darkness in Iran is not just a government-to-government responsibility. It is an individual-to-individual, group-to-group responsibility. And so we can have a double barrel of engagement. We can, voice our concerns to our government, but we can connect with individuals and NGOs across the nation and across the globe to increase our power and our influence exponentially. And that's what I work on a lot.
One more question for, I think, Soona and Mark, and this gets into the sort of, again, what I would call access and transparency, which are not two of Iran's strong points, as you would agree. So, look, if we're trying to get to the bottom of what happened in 1988, as Mark and as Ken said, we've got to have access to sites that have been off limits, right? And we've got to be able to talk to people who are off limits. And that requires, by persuasion or coercion, getting the Iranian government to agree to. So that's a very steep challenge. And so the question is, have we learned any lessons from the nuclear experience and for finding out, for instance, NCRI has done a lot of work to expose the nuclear secrets of Iran, but Mark, through the international community and gaining access to what limited access we have, any lessons learned from those experiences that can be applied here?
Well, I want to refer to some of the comments and reports that Ms. Asma Jahangir, special reporter on Iran, she was selected by the United Nations. And she mentioned even every time that she's talking that people inside Iran who are being connected to her to report that what happened to their families and individuals then, or try to find out where the grave is, and all these details that want to be connected to her and come to her. Later on, she finds out that government have been harassing these families, raid their houses, arrested, and sometimes in cases disappear. So I think international community here, especially United States government, it's very important to come forward, as very eloquently mentioned by the panelists, that there should be pressure on the Iranian government to let that the special rapporteur, Ms. Jahangir, to visit Iran and also be able to visit all these. There are more than 450 prisons. This we know. God knows how many more inside Iran. So it's very important that she be led to visit Iran and have a chance to talk to some of these families. And also, I think if to this happen, we need an administration here very strongly, supporting that. And also, we need the UN also to come forward and pressure all these member states, pressure. And in terms of the information coming out, sometimes when NCR wants to get an information from inside Iran, there is this whole family being, risking their lives to get us a picture. And I'm sure you have seen in the book, we have the pictures and names of 20,000 people, this red book. And so sometimes we're getting a picture of one family or anyone out there, maybe the whole family being executed. So it's a really tough situation, but I'm sure, through Congress and through support of the Iranian community and people inside Iran and people as distinguished as people on the panelists, we can move forward. And one thing that I want to mention is that the judiciary right now in Iran is totally in the hands of the Iranian regime and extremists in Iran. And since 1988, from the beginning of revolution so far, the judiciary system in Iran is completely going against actually the judicial system. They're completely in the hands of the mullahs in Iran. And they started all these mass execution then, and still the people in the same position, which is very dangerous. And they really have no opportunity for the Iranian people to present themselves. So back to you.
Well, I don't think I have any magic bullet here to add except to say the following. The European signatories to the Iran nuclear agreement have, in effect, need to do more to place human rights as front and center in their relationships with Iran. There's this perception, I think, that has been created that somehow or other they, more than even the United States, support this agreement almost at the cost of everything else. And so it's going to take some effective diplomacy at the United Nations and in Europe to try to, in effect, ensure that they do more to bring these issues and to, in effect, serve as a critical intermediary with the Iranian government and require that the Iranian government respond. Secondly, let me just add one other thought on this. Every tyrannical regime around the world, whether it be North Korea or Syria, other regimes that have closed off their countries to the inspections from the United Nations or rapporteurs, eventually wind up having to cave for several reasons. and that's largely because of economic and financial requirements. It seems to me that we need to, first of all, do more to see what leverage we have. And secondly, I'll close by saying the last thing we want to do is to misstep here. The Iranian people are proud. They're proud of their country. They, at times, see themselves being encircled by the world. The one thing we want to do is to hold the regime accountable against their aspirations and not be perceived as attacking Iran for the sake of attacking Iran. We want to win the support of the Iranian people in our efforts, and it's essential that we keep that in mind in all of our considerations, both tactical and strategic.
Well, let me thank our panelists. It's been great to have you, and it's really so heartening to see the level of passion and outrage and commitment that you demonstrate on behalf of the people of Iran and in support of the NCRI. And it's also very heartening to see all of you here who care about this issue and frankly are going to be the ones who kind of carry the campaign forward for justice and accountability. It will be a long haul, but we owe it to the memory of the victims and their families to do right by them. So thank you to the authors of this book. Thank you for shining a light. Let's keep at it.